Okay, so as we're working our way through Hebrews, this is the 17th lesson we've done so far, and we're getting there. Again, hopefully finish chapter 12. I won't go through all the preliminary stuff again, but we'll note that the theme is Jesus is better, and specifically for those Jewish Christians who are tempted to maintain their Judaism but do it without Jesus. Okay, we are finishing up Roman numeral 6, the need for persevering faith, and we will encounter the last of the 5 warnings in the book of Hebrews, the one found in chapter 12, verses 25 through 29. So we left off at verse 14 last week. The immediate verses before this had to do with discipline and viewing suffering as God's discipline, and God disciplining us because He's like a father who loves His children and therefore disciplines them. Okay, so this leads into verse 14. Make every effort to live in peace with everyone and to be holy. Without holiness, no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one falls short of the grace of God, and that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and defile many. See that no one is sexually immoral or is godless like Esau, who for a single meal sold his inheritance rights as the oldest son. Afterward, as you know, when he wanted to inherit the blessing, he was rejected. Even though he sought the blessing with tears, he could not change what he'd done before. You notice the contrast, the way Hebrews 11 is about these great heroes of faith, and now we get kind of, just a snippet of what it looks like to be the anti-hero or the opposite of the person of faith, and Esau is that example. So he's going to mention you don't want to be like Esau, clearly. So chapter 12 gets practical in many ways. He's talked all about the great heroes of faith in chapter 11. Now in chapter 12, he says this is what it should mean to you. So the first thing is to make every effort to live in peace with everyone. So it's about doing, and we're going to have a lot of doing in this chapter. And so it's not just that you are a person of peace, but you make efforts to be at peace with everyone. Now, obviously, it's not always your choice whether or not you live in peace. But I would venture to say that the vast majority of people who aren't at peace choose not to be at peace. The vast majority of people who aren't at peace choose not to be at peace because they aren't making an effort to be at peace. It's one of those things where do you want to be right or do you want to be happy? Sometimes there are a lot of things in this world that it's okay to say, I give up. Because my relationship with you matters more than this certain thing. So, remember Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers. A lot of times we think of peace being just the absence of any kind of conflict. And that's certainly true to a certain extent. But it's more than that. To be a peacemaker is to be someone who not only doesn't have conflict in your own life, but you try to help other people to live peaceable lives as well. So in this context specifically, I've already said we don't know that Paul wrote Hebrews. The Hebrew writer is saying, in a culture where you're facing persecution, it's not always going to be up to you whether or not you're at peace. Somebody might pick a fight with you, but don't be the fight picker. Don't be the one that's causing the trouble, right? Stand in obedience, but don't go looking for persecution. Don't try to provoke people into hating you, that kind of thing. So make every effort to live at peace with everyone. And I should say that definitely applies to those within the church, not just outside. He'll say more about that in just a minute. So make every effort to live in peace and to be holy. So you have to make an effort to be holy. God's doing His part. He disciplines us so that we can be more like Jesus. But we also have to strive ourselves to be holy. And the reason is, He states clearly, without holiness, no one will see the Lord. And He's kind of setting up this idea of we should see our lives as lived in the very presence of God. And if you want to be able to approach God, then you have to be holy. Holiness, of course, means to be set apart, to be different, to be unique. So We're called to be holy. Remember Jesus said, be holy as I am holy. So now verse 15, he says, see to it that no one falls short of the grace of God. So this language is, to me, really interesting because it's borrowing an idea that he's already hit upon. Now remember, in Hebrews, over and over again, we're rehearsing what the Old Testament says. So he's assuming that we know things about the Old Testament. He's also assuming that we remember he's already talked about some things. And back in chapter 3, he talked about the fact that the people of Israel, when they left Egypt, they wandered, but many of them did not get to see the promised land. That generation, that adult generation, didn't get to actually inhabit the promised land because of their grumbling in the desert, right? Because of the way that they ultimately disobeyed God. And he said that, so in chapter 3, he addressed this and goes on into chapter 4, so this chapter break's a little annoying, but you can see what he's getting at and how chapter 12 relates. So he says, of the people of Israel, and with whom he, God, was angry for 40 years. Was it not with those who sinned, whose bodies perished in the wilderness? And to whom did God swear that they would never enter his rest if not to those who disobeyed? So we see that they were not able to enter because of their unbelief. Therefore, since the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. For we also have had the good news proclaimed to us, just as they did, but the message they heard was of no value to them because they did not share the faith of those who obeyed. So in Hebrews 12, he says, be careful not to fall short of the grace of God, to be disobedient like the people in the desert. And they were grumbling, and they were fighting, and they were not at peace. They were not holy. So he says, see to it that you don't fall short of the grace of God, and that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and defile many. Again, he's hearkening back to the people of Israel and this time when, now he's talking about the time when they had received the law. He's going to talk about receiving the law in just a moment, but here he's referencing Deuteronomy 29. So he's asking the people basically to recommit to the law of Moses. And he says, Moses, quoting Moses, you yourselves know how we lived in Egypt and how we passed through the countries on the way here. You saw among them their detestable images and idols of wood, of stone, of silver and gold. Make sure there is no man or woman, clan or tribe among you today whose heart turns away from the Lord our God to go and worship the gods of those nations. Notice, make sure there is no root among you that produces such bitter poison. So we're looking back to the Exodus and entering the promised land. And there were those people who God had led them miraculously out of Egypt, out of bondage. And so all they had to do was go inherit that promised land. And they did not do it. And he's saying, don't be like that. Don't fall short of the grace of God. Don't let a bitter root grow up inside you so that even though you know you're going to something much better, it makes you fight with each other and tear each other down. So it's like a bitter root, so it's grown up within you, and, once it's established, it's really, really hard to get rid of. Moses warned about the same thing. So what's some evidence of bitter roots that can grow up in us? Well, the first one he mentions is see to it that no one is sexually immoral. Sexual sin has always been a problem, in this world, but among God's people, always. Clearly today, it presents itself in so many convenient and easy ways that past generations would never have imagined the kind of sexual immorality that's just displayed so easily among us. And so it has its own unique temptations of today, but it's always been a temptation. And if you're not convinced of that, just read your Bible, right? Seriously. In fact, let me reference this. I'm not in favor of this, okay? But I just want to point out an interesting thing that someone sent me. So, I really am not going to get political here. I promise I'm not. But you know that there are lots of fights going on right now about the kind of books that can be in kids' public school libraries. And So one guy, now this is a setup, okay? So one guy goes up to people who are in favor of banning certain books, we'll put it that way. And he says, did you know that there's a book in a lot of school libraries around the country that talks about a man whose daughters got him drunk and had sex with him? And these people are like, oh. And he said, do you think a book like that should be banned? And they're like, absolutely it should. And he says, do you know what that book is? And they're like, no, I don't know. It's the Bible. It's not even the worst story in there, right? So part of the beauty of Scripture is that it tells who we are, warts and all. And there's plenty of sin mentioned in the Bible, sexual sin being often one of the evidences of the fallenness of humanity. So he says, see to it that you're not sexually immoral. Be at peace with everyone. Be holy. Don't let a bitter root grow up inside you. And don't be sexually immoral. Or don't be, then he says, godless like Esau. So now he's going to refer back to that story of Esau. So remember, Esau did not receive the birthright. He did not receive the blessing. And a lot of that wasn't his fault. Now, having said that, right before his father died, it's clear that Esau was kind of late to the game. So when his brother shows up and steals his blessing, Esau, his worst sin would have been that he was just late at that moment. He was too caught up in other things. But it's clear that, he wasn't responsible for his brother's deception. But having said that, we see what Esau's heart is like throughout his life, and specifically in response to the fact that he lost his blessing. And so that's why he's an example of someone who is godless, who for a single meal sold his inheritance rights as the oldest son. So remember, he had the birthright and the blessing. The birthright that he lost was because he exchanged it for some stew. That was stupid, right? And then later he lost the blessing because his brother deceived their father. So, Esau, I feel kind of sorry for him. He's just not the sharpest knife in the drawer. But it's worse than that. He's godless, is what the Bible says. And so, for us, the appeal goes like this. You would never, for just a single meal, exchange eternity, would you? I mean, not for something small like that. But in so many ways, we exchange our own personal holiness for things that don't matter, for things that are going to get us caught up in sin or tear us down or alienate us from people. We let the small things get in the way. And these are some really powerful words, a lot of powerful words in Hebrews 12. Esau was rejected. So he wanted to inherit his blessing, but he was rejected. So after his father had said that Israel received the blessing, he says, I can't go back on that. Esau is rejected. And look at these words. Even though he sought the blessing with tears, he could not change what he had done. It's like at that moment, Esau realized how his whole life had led to this moment, and it couldn't be undone. No matter how much he pleaded and no matter how much he cried. Genesis 27:38 says, Esau said to his father, do you have only one blessing, my father? Bless me too, my father. Then Esau wept aloud. So you got a grown man, and remember, he's a burly man. He's an outdoorsman. And he's there weeping before his father at what can't be undone. So this reminded me of a poem, pretty famous one by Omar Khayyam, that maybe you've heard before. And I think it fits. It's a little bit of a downer, but on the other hand, I think probably you can relate, and I think it fits with this situation. So it's called The Moving Finger. The moving finger writes, and having writ, moves on. Nor all thy piety nor wit shall lure it back to cancel half a line, nor all thy tears wash out a word of it. So the idea once God has written something down and it's happened, no matter how badly we plead, no matter how much we say, I'll do better next time, once it's written and it's done. How many times in life have you said, I wish I could go back and change this, right? But once the moving hand has writ, it's over. That's the moment that Esau experienced. So this poem came to me, and then this past week, I came across a sermon written in 1909 about this poem. Okay, so this is a sermon about the poem by Omar Khayyam. And I thought you would, at least this has a little wisdom in it itself, something that maybe the Hebrew writer would agree with. A sermon by a guy named E.F. Dinsmore. I don't know anything else about him. Deeds are chiseled upon faces until, when a man is 50 years old, the expert can read the story of his life in his countenance. Even more true is it that the record of our deeds is unerringly graven upon our characters, where, however veiled from others' eyes, it blazes forth upon our own vision. And I would 1,000-fold rather have that record exposed to the view of the world than be obliged to face it myself, if it be the record of a life wasted, a record of failure. The contempt of others is hard to bear, but it is the balmy breath of paradise beside the scorching flame of a soul's contempt for itself. That moment when you look back in regret over years, decades, a lifetime of regret. And that's what Esau was experiencing. And at that moment, there's no harsher judge than yourself. Well, there is a harsher judge, but no harsher judge on the earth. And the Hebrew writer's trying to warn us. Don't live with that kind of regret. So he moves on. Verse 18, you've not come to a mountain that can be touched and that is burning with fire, to darkness, gloom, and storm, to a trumpet blast, or to such a voice speaking words that those who heard it begged that no further word be spoken to them, because they could not bear what was commanded. If even an animal touches the mountain, it must be stoned to death. The sight was so terrifying that Moses said, I am trembling with fear. Okay, so for this part of Hebrews to make sense, we've got to know what happens in Exodus chapter 19. So this is just before God gives the Ten Commandments. And for what's going to be said here and in the next passage to make any sense, you got to have an idea of what transpires just before the giving of the Ten Commandments. So the people have gone through the desert of Sinai, and now they're near Mount Sinai, and something big is about to happen. And we're going to read starting in Exodus 19, starting in verse 9, all the way through the end of that chapter, for you to get an idea, just to make sense of what Hebrews 12 is saying. The Lord said to Moses, I'm going to come to you in a dense cloud so that the people will hear me speaking with you and will always put their trust in you. Then Moses told the Lord what the people had said. And the Lord said to Moses, go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow. Have them wash their clothes and be ready by the third day, because on that day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. Put limits for the people around the mountain and tell them, be careful that you do not approach the mountain or touch the foot of it. Whoever touches the mountain is to be put to death. They are to be stoned or shot with arrows. Not a hand is to be laid on them. No person or animal shall be permitted to live. Only when the ram's horn sounds a long blast may they approach the mountain. After Moses had gone down the mountain to the people, he consecrated them, and they washed their clothes. Then he said to the people, prepare yourselves for the third day. Abstain from sexual relations. On the morning of the third day, there was thunder and lightning with a thick cloud over the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. Then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke, because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. As the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him. The Lord descended to the top of Mount Sinai and called Moses to the top of the mountain. So Moses went up. And the Lord said to him, go down and warn the people so that they don't force their way to see the Lord, and many of them perish. Even the priests who approach the Lord must consecrate themselves, or the Lord will break out against them. Moses said to the Lord, the people cannot come up Mount Sinai because you yourself warned us. Put limits around the mountain and set it apart as holy. The Lord replied, "Go down and bring Aaron up with you, but the priests and people must not force their way through to come up to the Lord, or he will break out against them." So Moses went down to the people and told them. Okay, so all of this is background to what he said in Hebrews 12 about this mountain and about, one of the Bible commentator calls it the pyrotechnics of Mount Sinai. Okay, so there's so much going on there. And this is where it's really going to be puzzling if you haven't been following along in what Hebrews is saying. He says, you have not come to a mountain. So he's saying, you're not experiencing this same moment that they experienced. Yours is more serious than that, okay? He's going to say that in just a minute. Right now, he's saying, you haven't come to this. So he's referencing what happened in Exodus 19. Then he's saying, but this is not like what you're doing. Yours is, it's like it, but it's much more serious than that. So he says, you've not come to, and now everything else is referencing what happened in Exodus 19 and some in chapter 20. So here's the general idea is this. You've come to something that's eternal. The Mount Sinai on earth and all the display that was done there, that was temporary. You've come to the eternal Mount Sinai. Okay? You've come to the real one. And it gets back to what we referenced before, this idea, I say borrowed from Platonic thoughts, that he said, what we see on earth is just a copy of a heavenly thing. And the temple on earth is just a copy of the temple in heaven. So he says in Hebrews 8 about high priests and the gifts that they offer. Verse 5, they serve at a sanctuary that is a copy and a shadow of what is in heaven. All right, so this idea of copies, what we see on earth is a copy of the thing in heaven. This is the same idea that he's borrowing in Hebrews 12. And so he says, you haven't come to the physical one on earth with all the pyrotechnics. So it's burning with fire, darkness, gloom, and storm, a trumpet blast, and a voice speaking from heaven. So bad that they were begging, we can't stand this anymore. Moses is terrified, and he says, I'm trembling with fear. But this isn't your moment. This is what it was like for them. Okay, so he's contrasting and saying, but yours is more serious because, verse 22, but you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, and heavenly Jerusalem. The heavenly Jerusalem. You've come to thousands upon thousands of angels in joyful assembly, to the church of the firstborn, whose names are written in heaven. You've come to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. So if you had to pick a moment, the most, dreadful, awe-inspiring moment in all the Old Testament for the people of Israel to describe, it probably would be Exodus 19. This moment when God came down on the mountain, God spoke and they heard him. And they're afraid, and then they have to rope off around the mountain so the people don't get too close. This is the moment when they encounter holiness and they can't get too close. And so, it goes down in Israelite history as the moment when God came down and gave his law to Moses. That's in Exodus 20. And what the Hebrew writer is saying is, no. There's something much greater that you're coming to. Because he says, you've come to Mount Zion, the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. So remember, the things on earth are just copies of things in heaven. So you've come to the real deal now, to the real mountain. So it's not just that there's fire and billows of smoke and a scary voice and that kind of thing. There are angels. In fact, it says thousands upon thousands of angels. The word there is myriads. Myriads. So you're not just coming with your fellow Israelites. Now you're seeing thousands and thousands of angels there. Again, this is a more serious moment than anything Moses experienced. So when you think about approaching your God, realize that Moses didn't know anything like you get to know. Remember, Jesus is better. Because we know Jesus and Moses didn't get to, then there's more at stake. And the language he uses here is really interesting. He says thousands and thousands of angels in joyful assembly. And the word that he uses there in Greek is panegyris, which, if you've ever heard the term panegyric, it can be used as a long poem that's dedicated to somebody, but that comes out of festivals. So people would have festivals, and they'd have all kind of arts, and they'd have all kind of presentations, this kind of thing. So a panegyric was, in Greek society, was a huge festival. And it's kind of a great party. And this is what these angels are doing, okay? Now, so I got to digging a little bit, and I'm not a scholar of ancient Greek by any means, but I really am not a scholar of modern Greek, okay? I mean, I've taken biblical Greek, and I can use it some, but modern Greek, which uses the same letters, is only related to biblical Greek. It's certainly not the same, but I did discover this, which is that the Greeks today still have these panegyrics, so they call them panegyri. And I just happened to find on a Greek website, a website advertising Greece, why panegyri is a unique Greek summer experience that should not be missed. Okay, so this is today you can experience this in Greece. And the way the website describes it, a panegyri is a centuries-old traditional and cultural festival organized during the summer months, mainly in the villages of Greek islands and mainlands, where the patron saint is celebrated. So you'll see that it's tied in now with the Greek Orthodox Church. However, it precedes Christianity. Okay? So these festivals were not Christian festivals to begin with, but then as Greece becomes Christian, thanks to the work of people like Paul, then they change, we'll say, they change their panegyrics and make them more Christian. They Christianize them. Maybe instead of after a pagan god, they put it after patron saint, that kind of thing. The feast begins at the local church in the morning and is followed later by good music, food, local wine, and lots of dancing, which are the key elements that make a panegyri what it is. Okay? Now, the reason I wanted to show you this is because I wanted you to see the pictures that they use to talk about these panegyri. So this is in some Greek town in their summer festival. So you see the people there. Obviously, they're eating and they're just all congregated together. And it's the kind of thing we were all doing before COVID and didn't think twice about it, And now it's like we hardly ever get together like that anymore. Anyway, so I'm enjoying the fact that more and more we're able to assemble. But so this is another picture from that. So let me suggest to you, if you'll let me, when you're imagining that you've come to the heavenly Jerusalem and you're seeing thousands and thousands upon angels in joyful assembly, they're like this. They're up there partying in the presence of God. Kind of reminiscent of, what Luke says when the shepherd who lost one sheep and went and found it. He left the 99 and went and found the one. Or the woman who had 10 coins and she lost one and then she found it. What do? They throw a big party. And Luke says in the same way, there's rejoicing in the presence of the angels of heaven. So you've come to thousands and thousands of these people, of these angels. Now it's not just you and Moses and you and your fellow Israelites. No. It's much more serious than that. You've come to these angels in raucous celebration of God. But that's not the only ones who are there. So he says, you've come to the church of the firstborn, whose names are written in heaven. A couple of things worth noting here. I don't know exactly how to interpret the church of the firstborn thing, but I think I have a good idea. But let me say this. I remember back in my... Back when I was first baptized in the Church of Christ and I was kind of learning the lingo and that kind of thing, I remember being taught to debate with people about the name of their church. We have the right name because, first of all, it's a church that belongs to Jesus. It's Christ's church, the Church of Christ, which is a really, really good thing. Secondly, it's a biblical name, right? You can read Church of Christ in the Bible, which is also certainly true. So, kind of the argument we would use is you can't use a name that you don't find in Scripture for the church, but we have to admit that Church of Christ isn't the only name that you find. The Church of God is used. The Church of the Firstborn is used. So, there are a few names that would qualify. Now, I don't think it's quite that simplistic because these weren't formal names in the Bible, okay? Church of Christ wasn't giving you as opposed to some other church. It wasn't the formal name. It was the church that belongs to Christ. It was the church that belongs to God, that kind of thing. So it's an assembly that is devoted to Christ, devoted to God, that kind of thing. It's not a formal title name. Later on is when we deal with the title stuff. But here, I actually don't think the Church of the Firstborn is referring to Christians. I know that might sound weird, but I'm certainly not the first person to say this. Remember, the word for church there can just be translated assembly. And the Hebrew writer in chapter 11 has already told us about all these great heroes of faith. And remember, he says, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. So he's saying, envision all these people around you. So I think what he's referencing is the fact all these heroes of the Old Testament that have gone on before, they're the church of the firstborn. They were hatched earlier than we were, and they weren't Christians per se, but they were obedient and faithful, so that they've already gone on to their reward, and now we come to not just God, but to the angels and to that great cloud of witnesses. So in that sense, they're the assembly of the firstborn. They're the first fruits. But I could be wrong. And so he could be referring to just the earliest Christian martyrs here. And that could work too. But I think in the overall theme of Hebrews, I think he's referring back to people like Abel and Abraham and Moses and Sarah, all those, the people back in chapter 11. So we've come to all these angels having their festival along with all these great saints of the Old Testament, if you will. But more than that, you've come to God, the judge of all. So you've come to God himself. And now there's not a rope to keep you from getting too close, like Exodus 19 indicated. So this is deathly serious. Because, remember, in the context, if the temptation is to say, well, ever since I believed in Jesus, my life has become more difficult, and even though I am a faithful Jew, my Jewish family wants to disown me. My Jewish patrons of my business no longer want to use me as to come to my business. The Romans are against me. Life is just getting a lot harder because I decided that Jesus was the Messiah and to put my faith in him. And so what if I just did away with the Jesus part and continued on with the Judaism part? Because, we've got a good long heritage, and just kind of put the Jesus stuff to the side. And the Hebrew writer, this is now the 5th time, is warned, this is dangerous stuff. You do not want to play with the idea that you can say to God, I don't really need Jesus. And so he uses this very serious language. So much more serious than Exodus 19. You have come to thousands of angels in celebration. You've come to the church of firstborn, but you have come to God. And he's the judge of all. And realize you're going to have to answer for what you said about Jesus. This is a lot more than just a mountain that's on fire or shaking. He says, you've come to the spirits of the righteous made perfect. And so, again, to those saints who've gone on before, I like the way it's said here. It's the spirits of righteous people made perfect. See, that they were righteous but not perfect people. I know a lot of righteous people. I don't know any perfect people, but I know a lot of righteous people. So this is just an admission that so many of the righteous saints in Hebrews 11 were not perfect. Again, just read the story. The scriptures are very clear about the brokenness of even a lot of the best people in the Old Testament. Sometimes they do the worst things. So the spirits of the righteous made perfect are also there. And you've come to Jesus. So you can't do the I'll do God without Jesus part, because you've come to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant. He's already talked about that covenant. Remember, he's quoted from Isaiah. I'm going to give him a better covenant. Based on better promises, he says. And so you want that new covenant. You need that new covenant. You come to he says, the sprinkled blood. This is referring back. So he's kind of doing a catalog of all the stuff he's addressed before. And he referred to the fact that the priests used to, in the tabernacle, would have to sprinkle blood onto the ark, right? There, in between the two cherubim. And so there's a sprinkled blood. But now it's the sprinkled blood of Jesus. He's also talked about blood, the blood of Abel. He said that Abel's blood, cries out. And so he says in chapter 11, even though dead, he speaks. And it's his blood in Genesis that it says, God says, Abel's blood cries out to me. Well, Jesus' blood cries out too. However, Abel's blood is crying out probably for vengeance, right? Because he has been murdered unjustly. But Jesus' blood is crying out a better word than that. It's a word of salvation. So you don't want to neglect this heavenly city, this Mount Zion, because that's where Jesus is with a better covenant, with blood that can really cleanse you. It speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. It's not to condemn you, it's to save you. It's so much better. Now verse 25, see to it that you do not refuse him who speaks. If they do not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth, how much less will we if we turn away from him who warns us from heaven? At that time his voice shook the earth, but now he has promised, once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. The words once more indicate the removing of what can be shaken, that is, created things, so that what cannot be shaken may remain. So he starts off and says, so don't refuse him who speaks. Don't refuse Jesus. Remember, his blood is the one who speaks a better word. Because if they, the people who didn't enter the promised land, it says, if they didn't escape when they were warned on earth, how much less will we? He's made the argument before from less to greater. Now he's going from greater to less. If theirs was, if they didn't escape because of they did this warning, how much less will we escape? We have a less chance of escape than they do. About the one who warns us from heaven, right? The place where ultimately we're going to be. And he says, at that time, his voice shook the earth. Remember, we're talking about Exodus 19 and God, what happened there. But now he's promised something even better. Once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. And that's a quotation from Haggai 2:6. This, in Haggai 2:6, we've moved forward after the destruction of the first temple, the building of the second temple, after the Babylonian exile. And what God has said is this: there's coming a day when I'm going to shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. So he's saying, the moment that you have for the giving of the law there in Exodus 19, I'm going to outdo that one. And the Hebrew writer says, well, the words once more, they're talking about how he's going to shake things. And the question is, what's going to remain after the big shaking? The things on heaven and on earth that are shaken. So that what cannot be shaken may remain. And so we end up the chapter with this. Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us be thankful. And so worship God acceptably with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. He says, since we're receiving a kingdom that can't be shaken, so the Israelites were subject to this shaking mountain, but our kingdom is not ever going to be shaken. So when God from heaven speaks, his kingdom will last forever. So we should be thankful. And as we are about to enter into a period of worship, anytime we enter into a period of worship, that's a reminder of who we are approaching. Let us worship him with in thankfulness, acceptably, with reverence and awe. Because we've come to this holy mountain, thousands of angels, the saints of old, God himself, and Jesus. And our God is a consuming fire. Remember, this is a warning passage. So he's quoting from Deuteronomy 4, where Moses says, "Be careful not to forget the covenant of your Lord your God that he made with you. Do not make for yourselves an idol in the form of anything that the Lord your God has forbidden, for the Lord your God is a consuming fire, a jealous God." And so when we speak of God being a consuming fire, we're talking about God is jealous and how he alone deserves our worship. It was good for the Hebrew people in the audience of Hebrews to remember. It's good for us to remember too as we enter to worship. Thank you so much for your attention. You're dismissed.